Hi, everyone. Thanks for that introduction. That's from my Twitter bio. Anyway, I'm Susan. I, as we said, work on the Firebase team at Google. I'm so thankful to be here. I actually grew up in Atlanta, so it's really fun to be back and be here on stage with people that I really respect. So this is amazing. I'm really excited to talk to you about recursive form controls. When I was practicing, I talk really fast, so if I start talking really fast, just kind of like in the front row, like glare at me, and I'll like take a deep breath and try to calm down. Just so excited. So what are recursive form controls? Thanks, Google, for this great joke about recursion. What are they? So it's actually a form control within a form control. So if that doesn't make sense to you, hopefully by the end of this talk, it will. And so the other question that I think we should definitely ask when we're thinking about this is why would we need them? And that's a good point. So forms are really the only way for the user to get information back to us, which I think is really important. So if you want to enter in your credit card, you probably need a form. And so recursive form controls are a way of taking a form control. If you have a form control for like a time and a date, and you kind of want to smush them together, that's actually kind of hard to do in a single form. So if you look at this, this is kind of something that we would want to see. So we have here a time selector, and we have a date picker, and they output a single value. And that's really great. There's actually no material date time picker, if you are familiar with that. There's only a material date picker, and so this is a component that I've wanted frequently. But it's a little complicated to build, so we'll actually go into that. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about inputs and outputs. I think this is like pretty basic top-level Angular stuff, and then hopefully I'll bring it like one level down. I'm not going to get into change detection and all of that like goodness, so I'm like in between just the top level and the really low level. And then we'll also talk about CVAs, which hopefully by the end of this talk you'll know if you don't know what they are now. And then we're going to take those two things and kind of smush them together and build a date time component. So we know this is, Angular is really great because it allows us to componentize our website. So we have a modern web browser here, and we have broken it up into different components. And to pass information, we use inputs and outputs. So this is really should be standard. We're looking at inputs. We set the value. If we want to emit information, we use the output. There's a bunch of other ways to pass information around, like observables. NGRX store kind of handles state. You can actually package an object and edit state that way. But I think that inputs and outputs are the most basic one. And I actually didn't know this, but they're directives, which means that they allow you to attach elements to the DOM. And then I also found this to be really cool. It's a different syntax for writing them. So the other decorator is like a syntactic sugar for this, so inputs and outputs are list, and then when something changes on the website, it kind of goes back up into your change detection and finds all of these and updates them accordingly. So I think that's really cool. I had no idea that it worked like this until I like read the documentation. So that's really helpful for me to understand, and hopefully to understand kind of how inputs and outputs work when you break up your components and want to pass information. So now, with that aside, we can talk about forms and CVAs. And I think with forms and CVAs, it's like kind of throws that out the door because you can't, forms handle passing information for you, and CVAs do as well. So if you want to componentize your form, you use this thing called a CVA, which is a control value accessor. So if you have a really long form and you want some of it to be in its own component, you need to use a CVA. So basic inputs and stuff like this already have this logic for us. So that's what a basic input looks like. It handles all of this kind of information for us. But if we wanted to make our own thing, like a time selector, like this, we would need to implement a CVA. So what is it actually? As I said, it's a control value accessor. It's an interface. So I've been doing a lot of reactive forms, so that's what I'm going to cover here. In reactive forms, we really only care about register on change. So if you're wondering like why we have an interface with 3 different things when we only care about register on change. That's because CVAs work across template-driven forms and reactive forms. So if you want to implement stuff in a template-driven form, you'll need to implement some of these other functions. But right now, I just choose kind of to ignore them. And so these are all used by the Forms API. I'll go into this a little bit more in depth, but the Forms API kind of puts a lot of the magic together. So here's what the basic implementation of a control value accessor looks like. There's 4 parts to set up a control value accessor. So the first part is implementing the interface. And as I said, we really only care about this register on change and on change. So register on change function kind of confuses me. So I've renamed some of it to hopefully make it make a little bit more sense. So you're passed in a function from the Forms API. And it's called once. So the Forms API, when it recognizes that it's inside of a form group and it sees that there's a control value accessor, it'll come in and be like, hey, here's a function. And then you within your register on change are like, let me save that locally. And that's how I'm going to emit data. So that kind of takes some of this really cool logic and information about how to pass inputs and outputs out of your hands, and the Forms API handles it. The second thing you need to do, and this is in the child component, is provide a ng value accessor. So that lets you know that you're a value accessor and lets the forms be used. So the third thing you have to do is in your parent component. There's a lot of steps with CVAs. This is my main gripe about it, is it takes 4 different files and things to edit. But they can be really useful, so bear with me. You have a form set up in your template. You also need to give it a form group and pass in a form control name. And then within, the fourth part is within your parent form component, you need to build the actual form. And so that's using the form builder. We learned about this yesterday when we gave a talk about reactive forms. So this is pretty basic how to build a simple CVA. So now that we have all the basics, we learned about inputs, we learned about CVAs, let's try and push them together, make this date time editor. So let's start with building just the time CVA and get everything working. Because even though we have all of that code and we have all the just copy and paste code that you need, there's still a little bit of extra work that needs to happen. So I implemented everything the way that I showed it on the slides and put in my time component HTML file the input like this. So when you do that, it looks like this. You're like, yes, I did it. The form shows up, and you're like, nothing else happens. So what should happen is the time value should actually update there as I'm typing. That's what you would expect. That's how, when we saw it yesterday, that's how everything worked. The value changes update. So if you had a base form, that's what would happen. But because this is a CVA, the information is not getting passed back up to our parent component, where we're listening for it. So what do we need to do? We actually need to listen to our input. And so you can listen to the input using the change. And then in your time component file, you say, OK, I heard a change from the input. Now I'm going to call my onChange function, which is the function that the Forms API gave me to emit value to my parent. So I realize that input's giving me a change. I accept that, and then I emit that back up to the parent, which gives us this. So if you can see what's happening here, you type in a value, and then you hang out, it doesn't show up, and then you click somewhere off the page, and it goes into your, the value gets passed to the parent. And so what's happening here is a little bit of a gotcha, is that you also need to listen on key up. So that's just that tripped me up so much when I was building out all these forms. So when you implement key up and onChange like that, this works how you would expect it. So when you type in here, you'll see as you type the values update. So this is really great. This is actually, we've made it. There's a form component, and it's in its own component, and it passes information back up to the parent form. And this is kind of where a lot of things stop. So if you look this up online, everyone has their own form elements, and everything is kind of, that's it. But as I was saying, there's some cases where you might want to use recursion, where you might want to say, OK, I have this time and I have this date, and I want them to act as a single form element, because maybe I want to check the time somewhere and I want to check the date somewhere, but I want to also check the date time somewhere. And so that's where this can come in handy. So now let's keep going in our journey. So we have our app component file, which calls our date time. And we have our form builder, and our app component has a form group in it as well. That's really important because, as we'll see, we can put in our datetime component our two components, our two CVAs there, and see what happens. So we're doing all the same things, and let's see how that looks. You would think this would work. You're like, OK, like forms is kind of magical. Like it handles everything for me. Like I'm great, but you are not great. There's no data coming back into your parent form. And so what's going on here? I started to debug, and I went into my time component, and I was like, OK, if there's an onChange function, I know I'm being called by the Forms API. This is like the first step, because the Forms API has to get into the CVA to pass me the data so I can pass it to my parent. So I need to know that I have this onChange function. And actually, when you put the recursive, when you put the second form control within the form control, you never get this onChange function. So the Forms API doesn't know that it's a form. So you can see here in my debugger, when I type, it stops on the onChange. I go forward, and there's no onChange. So that's kind of a bummer. How do we get around this? So I was like, I'll just put another form group in there, which surprisingly works pretty well. So in my datetime component, so in the mid-level component, you add another form group. And this is just a local form. It doesn't get used anywhere. You pass in form control names, and you really don't need to do anything with this. It's just kind of a way for the Forms API to be aware that the time component exists. So now we're all good. This is great. Everything's going to work. It does not. And this is where I got like kind of stumped, to be honest, because I was like, what's going on here? I start debugging again. The onChange in the time component, everything works like expected. We get to the onChange, so we're emitting a value, which is great. But then I was like at a loss, because I was like, OK, I'm emitting this value. It should know that it exists. Like, what's going on here? And that's kind of when I stopped to think about how inputs and outputs work. And so the Forms API and event, the Forms stuff does a lot of this like passing around of information for you, which is great. It's really nice. But I think to understand how this is going to work, we have to go like one level deeper and be like, well, we're getting passed in an onChange function. And if we're getting passed in an onChange function, that's probably emitting an event. Like, I mean, there's a few other ways of passing information around, but the most angular way is like inputs and outputs. So knowing how input works, the basic one, and knowing how a bunch of other things work, we can be like, that's probably doing something, and we just have to find the right one. And, oops, sorry. Yes, there we go. We just have to find the right one. And so I was like, it's probably change. Like, I was like, this is great. Everything's happy. Like, I'm so smart. I got it. No one else has done this. It's probably change. As we can guess, it's not change. That would be nice if it were, but it's not. And so I put that in, and I was like, OK, let me actually like dig into this. And it's really nice because the material date picker actually lets you know what it is. It's date change, which is nice. So we can use date change and call a function that's going to call our onChange from the date picker. So when the date picker emits its change event, we are like, OK, I'm accepting that, and I'm going to call my update event. But the time component that implements our basic CVA, there's actually another event that we have to look for. And to find this one, I had to kind of dig through the docs and dig through the source code. I would actually highly recommend doing that. It was really fun. Which like is like I just like kept like looking around on the GitHub and like looking at what was happening, and I was like, everything started like fitting together, and I was like, oh my god, like this event triggers that, which triggers change detection. It was like a huge like fun time in my like day prepping for this. I think I probably learned more than I have in a really long time doing that. And what I found is actually like in the documentation, but on template-driven forms. So if you use those a lot, you'll probably have known what this is, but it's ng model change, which totally makes sense because you can double bind on ng model change. And so it definitely makes sense why it exists, but you need to call this and listen to this, and we call update time, which is in our date time component. So it makes a new date and passes that up to our parent component. And so when we do all of that, we get this, which is great. So as we type in information, it emits a date time. This is super amazing. I'm really excited about it. And so I was like, OK, I got all of this. Let me like implement some more time selectors, maybe the basic input. That's not what you want. So it's really easy to go in now that we have everything wired up and be like, I'll put in a slider for my time. So you can slide through time. This one was a little more complicated. It has actually like a third form control within there. So there's like a lot of like wiring. But once you know how to wire it up, it's actually super easy to do. So those are all of them. And so just to end, I have all of my code on my GitHub, and you can look through it. I didn't do any validation. Would highly recommend that with dates. So that's kind of like an exercise to the user. And so are we all good? Well, I actually think not exactly. So these are really cool. Like it's really fun to feel like you're kind of like cheating the system a little bit and like learning how things work under the surface. But so this was kind of like the first thing that I did when I learned Angular. And I built out the forms for our UI. And another team came in and they were looking at it and they were like, why do you have all these like form groups within form groups? Like, what's going on here? Like, which one do I edit? Like, what happens? Like, what passes information? And like, what's going on? And I was like, well, like, this is kind of the way that it has to be. And they were like, it's very confusing. So I think it's like useful in certain situations for like a date time picker when you want all three of the components to exist. But I think a lot of times you can get the same result by flattening your CVAs, so like not recursing down and having form controls within form controls within form controls, even though it's technically possible. So I would like recommend it with some hesitation. And that's it. That's everything. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's @thatgoldblatt. If you see that I have a bunch of followers, do not be alarmed. It's a long story. And so there's, if you want to hear more about the forums or hear more about my Twitter followers, you can come and find me, and then I'll link out to the GitHub. So that's it. Thank you.